The hallway on the third floor of St. Carver Memorial smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, same as always, but on that Tuesday afternoon in early October, it went completely unnervingly quiet. Cora Tindall was on both knees in the middle of it. Her patient files were spread across the linoleum. 26 pages she had spent 40 minutes compiling between a code blue and 2 blood draws. The binder had gone flying when Craig Belmont's shoulder connected with hers, hard enough that she'd grabbed the handrail to keep from going down entirely. She'd gone down anyway. One knee, then both palms catching the floor. The papers had scattered like something broken. She looked up. Craig Belmont stood over her with his arms folded and an expression she had watched him perfect over 6 weeks. Something between disdain and boredom, as if her presence on the floor was mildly inconvenient to his afternoon. "Pick those up," he said. He said it the way some people say good morning, like it cost him nothing. "Then come find me when you've decided to act like a professional." He turned and walked away. And Cora Tindall stayed on the floor of the third-floor hallway of St. Carver Memorial in Tucson, Arizona, with her files scattered around her and 14 people watching, and not one of them moved. Cora had come to nursing the way people come to things that are going to define the rest of their lives, not because it was practical or prestigious, but because something in her was built for it. She had grown up watching her grandmother manage a household of 5 kids and a husband with a bad back without ever once raising her voice, and she had understood even as a child that there was a specific kind of strength in that, the kind that showed up without announcement, the kind that stayed. She had graduated from the University of Arizona at 24 and walked straight into the ICU. Her clinical instructor had raised an eyebrow. Most new nurses spent time in med-surg first, built up to intensive care gradually. Cora had looked him in the eye and said, evenly, that she understood the risks and had already arranged additional shift, shadowing with 2 senior ICU nurses over the previous summer. He had signed off. That was 4 years ago. She was 29 now, and the ICU was still where she chose to be, on the floor before 6 most mornings, charting long after the previous shift had gone home. She had learned, in 4 years, what most people took a lifetime to understand, that the hardest part of caring for someone in crisis was not the medical knowledge, not the procedural skill. It was the decision to stay present when everything in the room was working against you, to keep your hands steady when the monitors screamed. To know that your calm was not a luxury, it was a clinical tool, and it saved lives. That morning it had saved one. A 7-year-old boy named Owen Reeves had come in the previous night following a seizure cascade his evening team had not fully managed to control. By the time Cora arrived at 6 and pulled his chart, she had spotted the interaction that had slipped through. A medication timing sequence that looked clean on paper until you mapped it against 3 hours of his vital sign trend. She had called the attending before she took off her coat. Owen was stable by 9. His mother sat in the hallway chair outside his room and pressed both hands over her mouth and cried. Cora had sat with her for 4 minutes, not because the policy allowed 4 minutes, because 4 was what she had, and she wasn't giving this woman nothing. She had been trying to finish Owen's documentation when Craig Belmont found her. Belmont had arrived at St. Carver Memorial 6 weeks earlier with the title of Director of Hospital Operations and a mandate from the board to streamline expenses. Within his first 2 weeks, the nursing staff had understood exactly what that meant. New response time requirements, mandatory documentation windows that did not account for the realities of acute care, a memo about staggered lunch breaks that had gone out on a Thursday and made a charge nurse with 12 years of experience cry in the supply closet before noon Friday. He was not a clinician. He had no clinical background, no patient care experience, nothing that would require him to understand what it looked like when a person's life was being saved at the same moment a database window was closing. He had an MBA from a school in the Midwest and a long career of turning healthcare institutions into percentages, and he seemed to find the part of medicine that lived between the numbers. The human part, the part that didn't optimize cleanly, vaguely offensive. He found Cora at the nurse's station at 2:14 p.m. with her incomplete report and her cold coffee and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been holding things together since before sunrise. Tindall. He didn't look up from his tablet. Your incident documentation for the Reeves case is 4 hours outside the submission window. That's the third compliance flag on your record this quarter. She kept her voice even. I was managing an acute situation in bed 7 this morning. The window opened while I was still with the patient. That's not my concern. He looked up then. This hospital doesn't run on exceptions. It runs on process compliance. The process exists to protect patients, Mr. Belmont. She was still even, still measured. This morning I identified a medication interaction that could have. I don't need a case summary. He made a small notation on his tablet. I need compliance numbers, and yours indicate a pattern of placing personal judgment above established protocol. That's a liability. With respect. A pattern, he repeated. Louder now. Deliberate. One of the nurses 2 seats down at the station stopped typing. Of believing your individual discretion supersedes hospital policy. That kind of thinking exposes this institution, and frankly, it exposes the patients you believe you're helping. She had heard iterations of this before. From attendings who viewed nurses as interchangeable, from administrators who had never been in a room with a patient who was afraid to die. She had learned how to absorb those conversations and walk away intact. She had learned to choose her moments. She started to. He stepped into her path, not dramatically, just fractionally, a small recalibration of his body in the space she was moving through. Just enough. I'm not finished. She stopped. She looked at him. You want to make this difficult. He kept his voice at conversational volume. That was one of his particular qualities. He had discovered at some point that measured contempt carries further than anger. That is your choice to make. But I have the authority to document this as a conduct issue, and I will use that authority. I suggest you take a moment, clear your head, and come speak to me when you're prepared to behave like an adult. Something crossed her face. She held it. I am behaving like an adult, she said. I'm asking you to treat me like one. He moved. It was not a shove in the way that word implies weight and intention. It was the kind of movement that could be described afterward as a misunderstanding. A pivot, a shoulder, contact that happened in a narrow hallway between 2 people who disagreed. But his shoulder was broader than hers by a significant margin, and she was carrying a full binder, and the force was enough to send the binder out of her arms and send her into the handrail and then down to the floor. Both knees, both palms. The sound of the paper scattering. The hallway went silent the way rooms go silent after a car accident, that total collective suspension when the air itself seems to wait. 14 people. She counted them later from memory the way her mind cataloged things automatically. 2 attending physicians, 9 nurses, including 3 from her own unit, a custodian with a yellow mop bucket, a patient transporter with an empty wheelchair, a laboratory courier. Not one of them moved. Craig Belmont looked down at her, and then at the papers spread across the linoleum. Pick those up, he said. He straightened his tie. Come find me when you've decided to act like a professional. He walked away. Nathan Quill had texted her at 1:52 p.m. In the area with Titan. Narcotics sweep near the district finished early. Want coffee? Can be there by 2:30. She had read it between the medication check and the moment Belmont appeared. She had typed back, yes please, with the full intention of following it, with something about how the afternoon was getting complicated. But then, Owen's attending had called, and by the time she came off the call, the argument at the nurse's station had already started. She never sent the second message. Nathan had served 9 years as a Special Forces sergeant before his left knee ended that particular chapter in a training accident in Georgia that wasn't dramatic enough to make a good story, but was thorough enough to end a career. He had spent 6 months in a 2-bedroom apartment in Tucson, figuring out what a person trained the way he was trained was supposed to do in an ordinary world, and then an old team sergeant had mentioned the county sheriff's K-9 expansion. He had been working with Titan for 3 years. Titan was a Belgian Malinois, 72 pounds, the specific color of caramel that had been left in a warm pan too long, with a black mask that made him look perpetually intent, which was accurate, because Malinois did not have another mode. His working harness was with black lettering, Sheriff K9. He moved beside Nathan the way a partner moves after 3 years of shared work, the same speed, the same awareness, reading the same space with the same attention. They came through the main entrance at 2:31 p.m. Donna, the woman who had staffed that reception desk for 11 years, recognized Nathan. He had brought Cora coffee in this lobby before. She knew his face, and she knew what it meant when that face walked in the way it walked in now, quickly, quietly, reading everything. She looked at him. She pointed up. "Third floor, east corridor." She paused. "You should hurry." He didn't run in the lobby. He moved at the pace that people with his training move when running is not yet the right call, but walking is not sufficient. Economy of motion, nothing wasted. Titan matched him step for step, ears forward, body compact and ready. The elevator opened onto the 3rd floor, and he came around the corner and stopped. Cora was on her knees. Her hands were moving through the scattered pages, gathering them back into order. Methodical, precise, the way she did everything. Her jaw was set, her eyes were dry. She was the most composed person in that hallway, and she was on both knees on the floor, and 14 people were standing along the walls, watching her collect her own papers, and nobody was helping. Nathan stood there for 1 second. Only one. Then he walked forward, and he crouched down next to her, and his hand came over hers, and he stilled it. She looked up. "Hey," he said. The word was very quiet, just that word, with everything in it. Her breath came out slow and steady and controlled, the way it came out after a long code when the worst was over. "Hey." He picked up the remaining pages. He stacked them, aligned them, and set the entire thing on the supply cart to his right. Then he rose. He reached down and brought her up with him. She didn't need the help. She would have stood on her own in 3 more seconds. She let him anyway. He held her eyes. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Something moved between them without language, the specific, compressed communication of 2 people who have learned to read each other across distance and noise and time. It said, "I see what happened. I see who you are. I see all 14 people who stood there and didn't move." Then he turned. Craig Belmont had come back for his tablet. He had left it on the nurse's station and come back to retrieve it, and he had turned the corner into the east corridor and stopped cold at the sight of a uniformed county sheriff's K9 officer standing in the center of his hospital hallway with a 72-pound Belgian Malinois at his heel. The dog was looking at him. The dog was very still. "What is?" Belmont's authority came back by reflex. "This is a restricted area. There are protocols for bringing animals into." Titan sits. Titan sat, perfectly still, eyes fixed on Belmont with the kind of unwavering attention that certain large dogs are specifically trained to deliver, and that most people find deeply unsettling when it is directed at them. Nathan took out the small notebook he kept in his left breast pocket. "I'm going to need your full name," he said. His voice was conversational, quiet, for the incident report. Belmont stared at him. "I beg your pardon." "Your full name. And I'll need you to stay in this hallway until my supervisor arrives to take statements." Whatever she told you. 14 people saw it. Nathan hadn't moved. He had not raised his voice once. He held the notebook open and the pen ready, and he looked at Craig Belmont with the particular quality of patience that is not passive, the kind that has assessed a situation and decided that everything is under control. "You put a hospital employee on the floor. In Arizona, that's battery. Class 1 misdemeanor, and in a licensed healthcare facility, the sentencing guidelines carry enhancements." Belmont's face had changed color. "You don't have jurisdiction in a private." "You're right," Nathan said. "I don't, but the Pima County Sheriff does, and there are 14 people in this hallway." He looked around. A sound, from behind him and to the left. "I saw it." It was Dr. Garrison, 61 years old, 22 years on staff at St. Carver Memorial, a man who had been studying his own shoes 4 minutes ago with considerable interest. He was not studying them now. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his chin up, and his voice was clear. "I saw the entire thing," he said. "I'll give a statement." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. "So will I." The voice belonged to a nurse named Bridget who had worked with Cora for 2 years and had frozen, she would say later, out of a reflex she was ashamed of. She said it now like she was correcting that reflex in real time, which was exactly what she was doing. Same, the patient transporter at the far end. I was right here. I called down from the desk. Donna had come up from reception and was standing at the hallway entrance with her visitor log in hand. I have a time-stamped entry. 1 by 1. Not loudly, not with drama. Just clearly, one after another, the people who had been silent when it mattered finding their voices 4 minutes too late and deciding that 4 minutes too late was still better than never. Craig Belmont looked around the hallway. He set down his tablet. The sheriff's supervisor arrived at 2:58 p.m. Belmont was asked to accompany her to the lobby. He was not asked twice. Cora finished her shift. She finished it because she had never left early in 4 years, and she was not starting today. She completed Owen's documentation, checked her other patients, and handed off to the evening team at 7:20 p.m. with complete notes and updated charts. She was professional and thorough. She was, as she had always been, exactly what the job required. In the parking garage, Nathan was waiting with the truck running. She got in. She fastened her seatbelt. She sat with her hands in her lap for a moment, looking at the concrete pillar in front of the hood. Titan pushed his nose between the seats and pressed it against her shoulder, warm and solid and deliberate. She reached up and put both hands on his face. She held them there. "Good boy," she said very quietly. They drove home through the Tucson night, past the lit-up hospital windows and the darkened streets of the district. And she didn't talk, and Nathan didn't push her to, because they had been together long enough to understand the particular shape of a day that has asked more of a person than it had any right to ask. 3 weeks after that, Tuesday, Cora received a letter from the hospital's HR department confirming that Crab Belmont's employment had been terminated. A separate notice from the county attorney's office informed her that a battery charge had been filed. She learned, from a colleague who knew someone in hospital administration, that there had been complaints at 2 previous hospitals, 2 sets of documentation that had somehow failed to appear in his references, a pattern, as it turned out, that had found its endpoint in an ICU hallway in Tucson. She read both letters, filed them, and went back to work. On the Thursday of that week, Owen Reeves was cleared for transfer out of the ICU. His mother found Cora at the nurse's station just before they left and stood there for a moment holding something, a card, handmade, crayon on thick manila paper in the uneven hand of a child, still learning to form his letters. A dog. A stethoscope, and across the top, in red crayon in capital letters that were not quite straight, "Thank you." Cora taped it inside her locker door. The hallway on the 3rd floor of St. Carver Memorial looked exactly as it always had. Same fluorescent lights cycling through the same hum, same antiseptic smell, same worn linoleum that broadcast every footstep. But something had shifted in it. Small and structural, the way a room shifts when the people inside it have been tested and have learned something about themselves they cannot unknow. The nurses on that floor stood differently now. Not louder, not harder, more present, more deliberate about the space they occupied and the weight of their silence. When a new member of the administrative staff raised his voice in the break room that December, not at anyone specific, just the generalized self-important volume of a man accustomed to rooms that deferred to him, he stopped mid-sentence. 6 people had turned and looked at him. Quietly, without aggression, they just looked. He did not finish the sentence. He did not raise his voice again. Cora heard about it secondhand, from Bridget, who told it with a small smile over the kind of terrible break-room coffee that never improved no matter the institution. Cora listened. She nodded. Then she picked up her coffee and walked back toward the ICU, because her patients were waiting, and she had never needed anyone to tell her that was where she belonged.